Our first journey is going to include the achromatic color scheme. A, meaning no, chroma, color. So no color, black, white, and a whole range of grays. So I wanted to start with this, and even though it's watercolor, I will tell you that this was a sketch for a painting, and it helps me get a sense of the values, because here's the finished piece. So I can move between these two pieces to understand the values before I make a commitment to a large sheet of watercolor. So by the end of the session, you'll be able to create thumbnail sketches, analyze light and shadow, perform observational sketching, compose a sketch with value patterns, control your brushwork, mix and apply paint to a support, produce wet value paintings, initiate a painting through the process of observation and design. So let's talk about value. With value, there are relationships in value, especially when we're talking about a single source of light. So the value is a relative variation in light and dark. It defines the shape, depth, suggests texture, because without value we can't have texture, we need light, usually raking light to show us texture, and provides visual direction. Now, there's two types of texture. There's visual texture, which means it's all an illusion, and then there is also actual texture, which means that the paint is thick and you'll be able to feel it. Or a sculpture is something that has actual texture. But a hyper-realistic painting of a sculpture has visual texture. We believe the textures that are flat, that are painted. Chiaroscuro is a beautiful word that really came to its height at the Renaissance. Illusion of depth through the blending of light and dark. So here we have major development during the Renaissance of the idea of chiaroscuro. The idea of modeling in chiaroscuro really began with Giotto, but then sfumato was really brought to its fruition by Leonardo. This is the softening of the edges and the sense of great depth. And then dominant tonality came with the Venetian painters. Tenebrism is extreme light and shadow. This is inspired by people like Caravaggio. His first name was Michelangelo, but we call him Caravaggio. And it's extreme chiaroscuro. It means it's dramatic, so always think drama. The emphasis is on the dark values. It's heightened contrast, usually by using the background as a kind of foil, and unusual light placement. So here we get a real sense of the light in this piece. So looking at this piece, we see that the light is coming down. Let me get a color here. This way. And we see the form very, very highlighted in this. With that, you have this beautiful composition of David and Goliath. Here's a little bit of trivia for you. This is actually a self-portrait of Caravaggio, who, by the way, a little bit of an E-True Hollywood story, was a murderer. Decorative value, or shallow space, occurs when we get a sense of flatness. There's a retreat from the illumination and the values to almost pattern painting. So it has a great Asian influence, Manet and the flattening effect of multiple light sources, and then also Cubism. The Fauve movement, F-A-U-V-E-S, the Fauves, which translates loosely into wild beasts, were coined that name because of their bright, bright colors. Atmospheric perspective usually occurs in landscape, and that's where we have a sense of distance, where things are further away, and what happens is as they recede, they're bluer. There certainly is less detail. The scale changes. The mountains become smaller. They're certainly larger than the trees in this picture. There's less color, and there's fewer simulated textures, visual textures, as the textures move away. So let's talk about value patterns. So we're going to look at Poussin. If you've been with me before, you know this is my go-to guy. So here we have value pattern in composition. The light source comes from the right, and these are patterns of value that reference one source of light, and you can extract the detail and focus on the values that occur in a composition. Here's another Poussin. This is a study for a painting, and here we get a great sense through the use of sepia ink and sepia washes on a probably antiqued or old piece of watercolor paper, but we get that sense of light and shadow and the drama. The light source in this tree study by Poussin is coming from the opposite direction, therefore the shadows move in the opposite way. Those shadows are called cast shadows. Wayne Thiebaud, his sketch pages are very interesting. And though his sketch pages are very linear in most cases, what happens is when you move over to his paintings and prints, they become very, very much involved in light and shadow. This is a woodcut with watercolor. Here are some of his cupcakes. This is ink and wash on paper. This is an etching. So you can see how consistent those shadows stay from the cake, I guess they're risers, in the same direction, even though the cakes themselves are different. Here's a color version. Here's a painting where the light source changes. This is an oil painting. Look at the shadows. Notice that each shadow, even though the cakes are different color, remains pretty much the same in terms of its tonality. And here's a beauty. One of Thiebaud's subject matters was the landscape of San Francisco and the broad hills. We get a real sense of light and shadow with this beautiful painting of a San Francisco street. The achromatic color scheme. So we're really talking about no color, black, white, and a range of grays. No color or hues. Achromatic painting lacks any color. So that means that you have to drill down and get to value. We're going to look at the work of Giorgio Morandi. Morandi's work is very, very dull. Most of it has no color. If it has color, it's usually quite limited. And one of the things that he did was he often painted still lives. He had a tendency to compose things much in the middle and do them in groupings that were very similar. But he really focused on the gray side of the palette, the achromatic side, even though there's a little bit of tan in this. Chuck Close and his giant self-portrait. To get an idea of the scale of Close's work, here you can see one of his paintings. And these are really, really stunning paintings because of his technique. He's quite the technician. And also the scale of this. These were all of his friends who posed for his portraits. And then another person, Dottie Addy, who combines not only really refined drawing and painting with words. These little pieces are under plexiglass, and they're intended to be read, kind of like a story. Keep that up, his mother said, and who knows what you could become. Tim Dolby, a painter. This is a black, white, and gray still life. Most of the ellipses are very, very successful. I like the composition because nothing's dead smack in the middle. We're going to talk about composition. That's coming up. Ted Kleiman. I miss him. He was a very dear friend of mine. And he had a show at the college back in 1990 something. And he did large black and white paintings celebrating his Jewish faith. This is one of Ted's paintings. These are very, very large. I was fortunate enough to be gifted a sketch page of his. And if you know me, you know that I love to look at sketches, unfinished works, and finished works. Joe Bradney, an oil painter. And here's a very simple but beautifully composed still life. Mushrooms and then garlic heads, broken apart, and onions. Lots of onions. We have one right in the middle, but then we have it surrounded by groupings. I'm going to try to make groupings sound like a social situation. You'll see when we get to composition. Sang H. Han. I saw these works in Lambertville. Just to give you an idea of the amount of detail in these paintings, these are oil paintings. Here is one of the paintings, and it's the canal along Lambertville. Very, very beautiful, detailed, and just absolutely beautifully crafted. Jos van Ryswyk, the painting of an egg. You'll notice that you can't see a hand with the brush. So here's what you want to think about. We're starting to talk about composition. Arrange your objects first. Find an area of interest. Steer clear of monotony. In other words, don't line everything up side by side like soldiers standing in a row. Equidistant has a tendency to be boring. Think diagonal in driving the viewer's eye. Do sketches, resolve your drawing. When arranging a still life, think composition, and there's more to come on that. And with that, we'll do exercises in class to understand our paints, to learn about the kind of paint that we bought and its tendencies, and also we will have our first large-scale project, which isn't all that large scale. I'm going to recommend 9 by 12 or 8 by 10, 11 by 14 maximum. When you're painting, after sketching and sorting out your composition and thumbnails, draw with the brush. Let's forget about the pencil. It was a great ride, but let it go. Keep your water clean. Dump it out and make sure it's clear so that it doesn't muddy the whites that you try to put down. Cut your paint with medium, not water if you have it. So I talked about gloss and matte medium. Keep darks thin and lights thick. And squint, squint, squint. By squinting at something, what happens is the middle tones drop away and you can look at the extreme lights and shadows. And that will help you see the values better. Value trumps color each and every time. If you don't have the values down, then the colors become either too intense or too washed out, and there can't be a happy middle ground.